things that
Court
aren't
trial. So let's
lies
get
is
into it.
Tupac Shakur really was murdered that night. Suge Knight was also shot. The prosecution has plenty of evidence. The question, of course, is who did it. It's also important to remember that all they have to establish here is that Mr. Davis did anything to facilitate, encourage, or promote this, and according to his own story that he's told, not just in his book, but to a federal task force in 2008, and like uncountable media appearances, he handed that 40 caliber Glock handgun to the shooter to avenge basically the beatdown that we all saw on video, and that's another thing that was real, that casino beatdown. But one of the most interesting things that nobody's talking about is all of those other people in the video, as well as the other three men in Mr. Davis's car, the gang lifestyle of the mid 90s, and we all remember the movies and how popular it was. All of those guys are dead now. They're either dead or in prison, and almost all of them are dead. They were killed in unrelated murders. So that's something that really shows it's a road to nowhere, the gang lifestyle. You wind up in prison or
Also, I mean, from a
pretty much every gang case you do. I prosecuted gang cases for years, and that's a feature of it. And one of the things, the way the prosecution has countered that is they've alleged gang enhancement. They've alleged that he was a gang leader. Mr. Davis was a gang leader, and what that does is by adding those substantive counts, by putting those enhancements into the actual charging document, that allows expert testimony so they can have people come in and explain what the gang culture was like and how there's basically omerta, like if you talk, you're a snitch and then you're dead. And so they've basically created a vehicle to introduce all that kind of testimony with the hopes of educating the jury and explaining why nobody was cooperating. One of the old detectives on that case, I saw a great interview where he said, they said, hey, this case has been unsolved for 30 years, and he balked at it and said, we solved this case back then. We all knew who did it. It was just a question of getting enough people to cooperate and getting a prosecutor with the backbone to actually file charges and pursue it criminally. So this is a really interesting one to watch. I also think that the prosecution did a very, very good job in their opening statement. I was impressed with that. The prosecutor he had command of the courtroom. He understood the law. He was looking at every individual juror. He wasn't relying too heavily on his notes. Tactically, I think the prosecution has done everything at this point that they should have done, and it's going to be an interesting case to watch.
yeah.
It's now day 2 of testimony in the Tupac Shakur murder trial, and jurors saw graphic autopsy photos of the rap icon. Prosecutors showed the body bag that held Shakur's remains, the medical examiner's tag, and a bullet fragment that was removed from Shakur's body during the autopsy. Jurors also viewed the full casino surveillance video of the fight between Shakur's entourage and the nephew of murder defendant Dwayne Davis. A retired Las Vegas police sergeant who responded to the brawl was asked about the police response by one of the jurors. The judge read the question aloud. Watch this.
After an incident like that, is it customary to not follow people who did the assault? Is it common for everyone to stay with who becomes the victim?
My position at that time, yes, it would be to stay with the victim because we had already radioed 2 other officers that were on scene.
Okay.
And as well as the MGM security had radioed to their officers up front. So it would have been my responsibility to stay with the victim to make sure that he wasn't in dire need of medical assistance or still wanted to file a report.
Remember, Davis is the only person who's ever been charged in Shakur's 1996 murder. He's accused of orchestrating the killing and has pleaded not guilty. Let's discuss with legal analyst and trial attorney Mercedes Colwin. Mercedes, great to see you as always. What is the prosecution trying to achieve by showing these autopsy photos to the jury?
Well, without question, Boris, whenever you have a crime of this magnitude, when you show such disturbing pictures, it personifies what you are doing as a prosecutor. There's a death here. There's a murder. Let's turn this and focus on the real victim here, Tupac Shakur. Not any of the other issues, not the memoir, not the proffer deal, not the tour book tour that Dwayne Davis did. No, we need to focus on the individual who lost his life on 9/7/96. And by showing those graphic pictures, it stirs emotion. And of course, a jury is going to be told you can't let sympathy step into deliberations, you can't let emotion step in, but you would have to have no blood in your system to look at this and not have some visceral reaction. And that's what the prosecution is going to really lean into at the closing, the death of this young star.
That visceral reaction paired with some of the footage that is glaring from the MGM Grand and that huge brawl that sort of sprawled across that room, they're trying to paint this as a revenge killing, and yet the prosecution doesn't have physical evidence tying Dwayne Davis to the scene, let alone to Las Vegas that night, at least according to his defense attorney.
But that's a great point. But this is a classic example of loose lips sink ships. Dwayne Davis had a sweetheart deal in 2008, proffered deal with the prosecutors so he could provide information and have immunity. But what does he do? He writes a memoir in 2019 describing what he knew of the death of Tupac Shakur, including this brawl. So of course now the prosecutors have a motive, which...
Now remember earlier that I said agents call agents? Well, that isn't just a one-off. Increasingly, we're seeing agents calling agents who might be also calling other agents. Well, if you look at this, it starts to look a little bit like the Netflix call structure, right? We are losing even more lines of availability in.
It starts reading from the memoir itself when it talks about when Dwayne Davis says that he literally handed the gun in the back of the car, and then of course the shooting ensues.
It's notable, he also speaks in the book about this sort of code among gang members to not talk about what happens. It's known as omerta, right? It goes back to mafia days. Talk about how complicated this becomes, this first claim that he was involved in this, and then his defense attorney saying, oh, he was just saying that to make money.
Well, it's very interesting. I mean, sure. I mean, they have to explain why their client would write this in their memoir, go on this book tour and make these statements that are so incriminating. So they have to offer some alternate explanation. But this thing about the murder and keeping quiet, even when the officer that testified yesterday, and he talked about being there after the shooting of Tupac Shakur, and Tupac Shakur, we know, survived for a period of time before he succumbed to his injuries. He was asked directly by the law enforcement officer, who shot you? And all Tupac said is, we'll take care of this. He didn't identify who the shooter was, and obviously, maybe he didn't see him, or so, but certainly he was kept quiet, and obviously we know that it remained with him.
Lastly, Mercedes, trials in the state of Nevada allow jurors to ask questions after cross-examination wraps up. What did you think of that question that a juror posed to that officer?
Well, I think the jurors really grappling with these are gangs. I mean, these are individuals who have gang ties. So who's the victim here? Is this just gang violence between two separate gangs? Is this some sort of retribution? So what they were trying to do is align the officer with who the true victim was. And obviously, according to the officer, it was Tupac Shakur who suffered ultimately a deadly wound.
Day 2 of the Tupac Shakur murder trial is underway. This comes some 30 years after the hip-hop legend was gunned down at the height of his career.
Prosecutors accused Dwayne Davis of orchestrating the 1996 murder in retaliation for an assault on his nephew. Meanwhile, defense attorneys for Davis argue that there is a lack of facts in the case. They cite the work of a former detective who was assigned to the case. He was, quote, biased, sloppy, and incomplete. CNN's Josh Campbell gives us a closer look.
We now have Mr. Davis. He's present in custody with Mr. Stamp.
Almost 30 years after rap icon Tupac Shakur was gunned down in Las Vegas, the trial for the man who prosecutors say orchestrated the shooting is at long last underway.
Let's bring in the jury.
Dwayne TPD Davis is the only person to ever be charged in the infamous slaying. Prosecutors say he didn't pull the trigger on September 7, 1996, but was the shot caller that fateful night near the Las Vegas Strip. Prosecutors are calling the 1996 killing an act of revenge.
What he did do was planned of retaliation.
Surveillance video shows Tupac Shakur leaving the MGM Grand Hotel with Suge Knight, Trevon Lane, and others after watching a Mike Tyson fight on the night of the shooting. They run into Davis's nephew, Orlando Anderson, who was standing alone in the lobby, and start attacking him. Months before, Anderson had pulled a Death Row Records chain off of Trevon Lane's neck at a shopping center near Compton. This escalated tension, the prosecutor said. They encountered each other again, this time in Las Vegas. The fight happened about 2.5 hours before the shooting, according to the prosecutor. On Monday, the prosecutor read excerpts from Davis's 2019 memoir, Compton Street Legend.
Them jumping on my nephew gave us the ultimate green light to do something to them.
While Davis's public interviews were also mentioned.
He admits to being the boss. He admits to being in the white Cadillac. And he admits to be part of the murder of Tupac Shakur.
Defense attorney Michael Samft warned the jury not to believe his own client's past statements about his role in the incident.
TPD was known to do this. That's the testimony you're going to hear in this case.
The defense also argued there's no evidence Davis was in Nevada when Tupac was shot, telling jurors to determine what is fact and what is fiction.
Look for evidence that shows that TPD was even in Las Vegas on the night of the fight. Receipts, credit cards, a picture of him standing next to somebody else. There's no evidence at all that man was even in the fight.
Davis is now 63 and is the only individual allegedly involved in the murder who is still alive. He's entered a not guilty plea. If convicted, he faces up to life in prison.
You have to corroborate everything I say in order for it to be true. What you're going to find is that the state cannot prove beyond reasonable doubt the claim that he had anything to do with a first-degree murder accused of anybody. There's no facts to that matter.
Prosecutors in Las Vegas are spending a second day laying out their case in the murder trial of hip-hop icon Tupac Shakur. Dwayne Davis is accused of organising the deadly hit against Shakur in 1996 near the Las Vegas Strip. On Monday, prosecutors said the ambush on Shakur was a, quote, act of revenge. Davis is the first and only person ever charged in the nearly 30-year-old murder case. Josh Campbell joins me now, and you saw some pretty graphic evidence and heard some very powerful testimony today, Josh.
That's right. The jurors were actually shown photos of Tupac Shakur's body as the prosecution and defense were questioning the medical examiner here in this area, who was essentially laying the foundation about the cause of death, the manner of death for Tupac Shakur. Again, that hasn't been in question. We've known now for 3 decades that he was shot and killed, but it's a critical part. It's something that the jury needs to hear. That is exactly what happened. Here, the pathologist had testified that they found 2 bullets still inside the body of Tupac Shakur. They said that they believe that the manner of death here was a gunshot wound to his chest as well as to his abdomen. And then the big question about who fired the shots is exactly why Dwayne Davis is now on trial for murder. He's been charged with orchestrating this entire hit job. Now, right now, as we speak behind us inside court, the jury is hearing from a series of law enforcement officer witnesses who responded that day here near the Las Vegas Strip after those shots rang out. And they're essentially taking jurors back to that place in time. Just before the shooting, there was this fight that occurred at one of the major hotels here following a boxing match by world champion Mike Tyson. And it was at that event that Dwayne Davis, who's now on trial, his nephew was part of a fight and essentially was beaten up by Tupac Shakur's entourage. In fact, one of the officers testified that he met with Orlando, is his name, after the fight and said, hey, do you want to tell us who beat you up? Do you want to file any charges? Orlando allegedly said no, which really tracks with later on what Tupac Shakur told police after he was shot, and that was he didn't want to identify the perpetrator, which really gets to a lot of the gang culture that law enforcement finds difficult. When people don't want to tell them exactly what happened, they have to very inspiring today as the court continues.
Yeah, a tough day. Thank you so much, Josh Campbell, for joining us from Las Vegas.
Day 2 of Dwayne Davis's murder trial, defense attorneys say he's shaken off his jitters and is feeling hopeful. Davis is the only person ever charged in connection with the death of the hip-hop legend Tupac Shakur. And prosecutors are not accusing Davis of firing the shots, but of orchestrating the killing. Davis has pleaded not guilty. The jury heard opening statements and harrowing testimonies yesterday. Witness Ingrid Stokes was just a few cars ahead of Shakur when she heard gunshots.
Why were you aiming at that light? Does anything happen?
Well, me and Shalane were going to change seats. I was going to drive. I'm the more aggressive driver. After what, she was nervous with them coming back in front of us so much. So me and Shalane were literally head down, taking our seatbelts off when we heard the gunshots. Okay.
And to be fair, you didn't see those gunshots.
No.
Australian legal analyst Joey Jackson is a criminal defence attorney and former prosecutor. He joins us now live to talk more about the case. Joey, so great to see you. Look, as we heard, I believe, from 4 witnesses on day 1 of this trial, but as we saw there, none said they could actually identify the shooter, and that also included a police officer, Gary Dale, who actually rode with Tupac to the hospital and even asked him the question directly, but was, said in court that Tupac refused to answer, saying he'd take care of it. So there was a lot of information to digest on day 1. What stood out to you from a legal perspective?
Tupac didn't say that. He was
Yeah,
talking
Christina,
about.
good to be with you. A lot of smoke.
Tupac didn't say he'll
Very
take care of it.
little
It was
fire.
he talking
What am I
about.
talking about? I
Lane.
think if you look at the prosecution's case, they're really leaning in to the confession, at least they call it a confession, of the person who's on trial, Mr. Davis, Keefe D. And why are they leaning into that confession, quote unquote? Because of the fact that he spoke with Keefe D, law enforcement, in 2008, and his narrative was that indeed he was involved, indeed he was the shot caller, indeed he orchestrated procuring the weapon and getting the white Cadillac. It was intimately involved. However, in the context of when he said that, of course, he was under investigation in a federal drug charge for which he could have gone to jail for the rest of his life. So you could imagine that the defense will seize upon that to give the indication that, of course, he would say that because, as we look at him there, the defendant, he'd say anything he needs to say to get out from under it. So prosecutors are really using his own words in addition to a memoir that he wrote in 2019. Oh, he didn't write it, the defense says. A ghostwriter wrote it, and he knows little about it. And in fact, KPD, we're looking at him, says, I wasn't even in Vegas at the time. Not yet, and still prosecutors are using that in addition to all of his media interviews to say that he was the guy. Additionally, prosecutors are saying he'd be motivated to do it. Why would he be motivated to engage in this type of retaliation? Because of the fact that Tupac and his crew at a Mike Tyson fight at the MGM Grand that evening, they beat up his nephew. So prosecutors are saying he was inflamed and incensed by that and went after him. But the issue now becomes, do you have specific eyewitnesses outside of the confession that Keefe D made that could support, substantiate, and corroborate that he engaged in this activity? And interestingly enough, Christina, when you saw the trial yesterday, the defense...
Today, your agency depends on a single platform, and that's a risk you don't control. If the algorithm changes, your revenue drops. If the...
And they're essentially using that, the defense is, to say that that confession was BS. This was a guy who was simply making money, their client. He was a guy who was puffing, getting street cred as a result of it. You can't believe the hype. And by the way, the defense says, where's the gun? Where is the getaway car? Where's the prints? Where's anything of a physical type of variety that would attach him to the crime? And my client wasn't even there. And so that's the interesting dynamic. Last point, Christina, and that's this. The witness that you just saw, that you played the clip on, she was actually in a car with her girlfriend. And she said that shots rang out and all hell broke loose, her words, but she did not see who was in the car. And then there was another witness, as we look at Tupac there, who was an actual bicycle cop who was bringing Tupac to the hospital after he got shot. And he asked Tupac what happened, and Tupac would not say who did it. And why do I bring this up? Because at the end of the day, do you have actual witnesses that could connect Keefe D to this murder? Whether they do or don't, that's going to have a lot to do with the outcome of this case.
Yeah, and related to Keefe D's previous statements, as you were saying, there, Joe. I mean, the defense attorney raised a key question here, which is if Dwayne Davis admitted to his role in Tupac Shakur's 1996 killing, and he did it again in 2008 and 2009, why did it take to 2023 to charge him? That's kind of an important point.
Oh, it's a significant point, and they leaned into that point and saying, well, there's a reason why it took so long, because they have nothing, and they never had anything, they being law enforcement, prosecutors, authorities, and that they're trying, the defense says, to make all of this hay about nothing. And in fact, the defense said, you don't even have a witness to put my client, Keefe D, in Vegas, much less put him in the car of that white Cadillac where the actual shots were fired. And so those are the competing dynamics here. The prosecutors really arguing that Keefe D's own statement should be trusted and relied upon to convict him, and the defense saying that if that's all you got, it's BS, there's nothing more, and in effect, you have nothing of the nature of eyewitnesses or physical evidence, let my client go. And so we'll see what happens as the trial develops and prosecutors continue to connect the dots to establish whether or not Keefe D is guilty, but you gotta get actual evidence to establish that and not only rely upon his words, because he's a street hustler, so to speak, is the defense argument, and he was making all kind of money saying this narrative. What else is he going to say?
And Jerry, just while we have you, I mean, one interesting or sort of quirk of this trial is that jurors are legally permitted to ask questions under Nevada state laws. How unusual is that, and how would that actually work?
So it's very unusual, but I have to tell you, Christina, they need to bring that to New York where I practice, because the bottom line is that you don't get the opportunity to actually ask questions in New York, and you should be able to, and jurors in general should be able to do that. It's interesting because you showed the clip of Ms. Stokes before, and in that clip of Ms. Stokes, what she was essentially asking or saying was that all hell broke loose. She asked the question, and a juror asked the question of her, and the question was, do you know where the shots came from? And of course, she indicated she did not. So I think the issue of the jury asking questions gives us a sense of what they're evaluating and looking at, and I think, quite frankly, it's a great practice, and it lets you know what they're considering, viewing, evaluating, and really looking for in a case.
Yeah, and just finally, what do you make of Keefe D's attorney's comment there that, you know, the jitters are out, the evidence has gone cold, it's gone stale now? You know, that kind of statement so early in this trial, is that just posturing at this stage?
Well, it is posturing because, of course, that's what trials are about, right? They're about the posturing in a case, and you want to, of course, exhibit that confidence, and you want to say, if you're the defense, that they have nothing, that as prosecutors do not have the goods to establish that your client is guilty. And so they're really leaning into the fact that there's no live eyewitnesses who can put him there, there's no physical evidence, there's no murder weapon, there's no anything, really, from a defense perspective that would suggest that he's guilty, other than these words, which are mere puffery, bravado, and him just making money, and actually, they're all fiction, says the defense, so that he could actually support himself, not admissions of an actual crime. But yes, indeed, they are posturing. Let's see if that posturing leads to a not guilty verdict, which at the end of the day is what the defense is looking for. Prosecutors, of course, want their conviction for first-degree murder with a deadly weapon.
All right, well, Joey, stay with us. I just want to bring our viewers up to speed on another case that's grabbing headlines. The defense has begun in a case of the trial of Lindsay Clancy, the 36-year-old mother accused of killing her 3 young children. Witnesses called to the stand repeatedly described Clancy as a caring and loving mother, pointing towards, as her own defense attorney argues, that at the time of the incident, she was suffering from severe postpartum psychosis. Speaking on Monday, Lindsay Clancy's mother described to jurors how her daughter changed in the months after giving birth to her 3rd child. Take a listen.
She would mention that this wasn't her mind. She would say to me, this isn't me, I've never been like this before. And I would agree because she was.
Joey, I know you're still with us. What do you make of how this trial is going, the overview here?
You know, I think there's a legitimate argument, Christina, to be made that there should not be a trial here. Now, obviously, we're keeping an open mind, but this seemed to be a loving mother of three who just legitimately one day decided to strangle her children. And so you ask why she would do that. And even in the prosecution's case, you saw witnesses who described her as, again, a loving mom who wanted to have a family, who spoke about her children very well, who enjoyed her life, and all of a sudden just went south and killed her kids and jumped out of a second floor window of her home. And so the question becomes, why would anyone do that? From a defense perspective, they're saying because it was the cocktail of medications that were given to her by her doctors who really misprescribed her, in addition to the fact that she just was suffering this postpartum psychosis and just could not control it. Why is all that relevant? It's relevant because they are trying to, they being the defense, establish that she could not appreciate the nature of her actions. And as a result of that lack of appreciation for her actions, she didn't know right from wrong and therefore cannot be criminally responsible. That's the core argument. And I believe by putting on her mom, by putting on her sister, by putting on her mother-in-law, and we're going to hear moving forward from psychiatrists and psychologists, as we did in the prosecution's case, the defense is really establishing or attempting to that something went drastically wrong. She didn't know what she was doing, and therefore she's not guilty by reason of insanity. That's the core issue in this case.
Happening today, more testimony expected in the murder trial of Dwayne Keefe Davis, orchestrating the 1996 killing of Tupac Shakur. We heard different versions of who Davis said killed Tupac. A former FBI agent testified that in 1998, Davis blamed Compton police, who he said were working for Suge Knight for Tupac's death. But a former LAPD detective gave a different account from the defendant. He testified that Davis described his own crew carrying out the attack.
Mr. Davis had the gun at first, but they came up on the passenger side of Suge Knight and Mr. Shakur's vehicle, so he couldn't shoot across the driver. So he handed the gun to Dre in the back seat, Mr. Andre Smith. He was afraid to shoot. Mr. Anderson grabbed the gun and shot across Mr. Smith into Mr. Knight's car that Mr. Tupac Shakur was in with Mr. Knight.
So which Keefe story will the jury believe? Joining me now, CNN legal analyst and criminal defense attorney, Joey Jackson. You've talked a lot about this because now we're hearing these two different versions of what he told police around, a couple of years after the murder. It really muddies the waters about the believability of Dwayne Davis, the defendant. But doesn't that fit right into his defense that he was just talking smack, if you will, and he's not to be believed even after he confessed his role in Tupac's murders to police?
Yes, Sarah, it really does. And just so by way of context, what happens is that the first time he told the story, this would have been in 1998, about a year and 10 months after the July 1996, September 1996 killing. What ends up happening is he knows nothing, wasn't involved, says in fact that this police officer did it, and that's his narrative at that point. Now fast forward 10 years later, Sarah, when he's interviewed by this LAPD detective, you just showed the clip, and what does he say? Now he changes the story, his crew's involved, he took the gun, he put it to the backseat. Why is all this significant? Because the whole case of the prosecution is based on and predicated upon his own statements, that is KPD. And in the event that you're basing it upon someone's own statements, should those statements not at least be consistent? Did he tell KPD the story in 1998? I did it, I was involved. In 2008, I did it, I was involved. No! So you're now having to parse through the inconsistencies of statements. And by the way, last point, if you consider the context in which he made the statement where he gave that admission, what we didn't show was that this same LAPD detective said, oh, and by the way, when he told us that, he was facing the prospect of a lifetime jail sentence in federal court for a drug conviction, so that's why he was playing ball with us. What else is he going to say? The defense will say, and that's going to be so important as to whether the jury buys the first story, the second story, or no story at all, because you need corroboration. It needs to be some independent witness that puts him there, and to date, the prosecutors have not done that.
The murder trial of the man accused of orchestrating the killing of Tupac Shakur, Dwayne Keefe Davis. Yesterday wrapped with the jury hearing differing versions of who Davis said killed Tupac. A former FBI agent testified that 2 years after the murder, that Davis blamed Compton police, allegedly working for Suge Knight. But a former LAPD detective also testified and gave a different account, saying Dwayne Davis told him that his own crew helped carry out the attack.
Mr. Davis had the gun at first, but they came up on the passenger side of Suge Knight in Mr. Shakur's vehicle, so he couldn't shoot across the driver. So we handed the gun to Dre in the back seat, Andre Smith. Witnessed the knife.
Joining me right now, CNN legal analyst and criminal defense attorney Joey Jackson for more on this, who's been watching all the twists and turns here. Joey, what's the impact of these, I'm going to call them conflicting accounts?
Yes, that's a good way of putting it. So it's significant, good to be with you and good morning, because of the fact that the prosecution is basing their case on the statement of the man we're looking at there, Mr. Davis, Keefe D. What do I mean by that? Prosecutors are saying, hey, juries, you can convict him because he told you about his involvement. We know that he didn't, or they're not saying, prosecutors, that he pulled the trigger, but that he was involved. And whenever you aid, abet, assist, encourage, counsel, you're equally as guilty. But the entirety of the deck of cards of the prosecution's case is built on his credibility, the credibility of the defendant, if you could believe that, by suggesting that, hey, he admitted it, and then he went on podcasts and YouTube and in the media and everywhere else, and he told you again that he did it. But did he? Because you have this inconsistency that is so significant. What inconsistency, Kate? You have him saying in 1998, when he was first interviewed by authorities, that he didn't have anything to do with it at all. And as a matter of fact, it was the police who shot and killed Tupac Shakur that we're looking at. And then 10 years later, he gives an interview and he says, no, wait, I really was involved. Last point, Kate, and that's this. You have to always consider context. It matters. In the context of the statement that he said, admitting that he was involved in some way, he was looking at a lifetime federal sentence for an actual drug case, and he was trying to, Keefe D was, get out from under that. So the defense will argue he would likely tell you anything to do it, and unless you have an independent corroborating witness that puts him there, which has not been the case yet, puts him where? In Vegas, puts him in that white Cadillac, puts him as an aider or abettor in that Cadillac and handing a gun to someone, then you have a case that really is teetering. And that's the issue right now and the significance of the inconsistency.
Also, that kind of throughout and playing in the trial is a lot of discussion around kind of abiding by the code of the street. From gang members to even former officers kind of talking about the role in that. What do you think of this?
So what happens, Kate, the relevance of that is you've got to explain to the jury why it took us 30 years to get here. And so prosecutors are laying out and talking about the Bloods and talking about the Crips and talking about gang activity and the code of the streets as we look at the bullet-ridden car right there. And what was the code of the streets? No one says a word. That's why we're here 30 years later, because people weren't talking. But now we have prosecutors say the guy who did talk, and that is Mr. Davis. But defense says you can't trust him because he told one story in 98, another in 2008, and by the way, defense argues, he was making money all the time, supporting his family, puffing, getting street cred for saying this. This is not to be believed. Where's the beef? Where's the independent evidence? Where are the eyewitnesses? And if you don't have that, the defense says, then you got nothing. What they have, of course, will be up to the jury at the end of the day. But what I'm looking for moving forward are some witnesses, absent his own statement, Keefe D, that actually put him at the scene and doing something like committing a crime. That's what we're looking for moving forward. If they can do that, then they're in good shape. Prosecutors are. If they can't, then there might be some trouble.
It's now day 3 of testimony in the Tupac Shakur murder trial, which resumes at the top of the hour. Jurors witnessed a testy exchange yesterday between the defense and a former associate of Death Row Records CEO Marion Suge Knight. Explosive moment with James McDonald, the former gang member who ran security at Knight's Vegas nightclub.
Is that what you taught me?
I'm telling you, the people that was at 6
Just answer my question, sir. Yes or no?
I can't
Is it
answer that without a what you call it. You trying to tell me to say something that you're not going to understand. If you let me explain to you.
No, answer my question.
I'm not answering nothing. I don't know what you're talking about. You ask me something I don't want to talk about, you're going to have a problem. Treat me as a hostile witness. You're not going to talk to me and tell me as a grown man what I have to do up here. I'm not going to send him to prison. You are.
Let's discuss with former criminal defense attorney and former prosecutor Mark Mera. Mark, great to see you as always. McDonald was in part describing how beef and this rivalry between Death Row Records and Bad Boy Records had led to more tension between actual street gangs, the Bloods and the Crips. How does his testimony fit into what the prosecution wants to prove?
Well, in effect, just remember the premise of this is we're starting with the fact of a 30-year-old cold case. Difficult to prove because age never helps the prosecution. And put on top of that, you have witnesses like this one that we heard yesterday and others that I'm sure we're going to hear from that do not want to testify. It makes the state's case much more difficult to prove because, in effect, they've got to convince that jury beyond a reasonable doubt that the death occurred and who's responsible for it. And when they have recalcitrant witnesses, those who do not want to speak, those who won't show up, or those who will simply not tell the truth, even if under oath, it's going to make the prosecution much more difficult.
What I found really interesting about the exchange, it was with the defense attorney. It wasn't even with the prosecutor. And he told the defense attorney, as you saw there, you're asking me questions, I can't answer those questions. And then he turned to Dwayne Davis and he said, talk to your lawyer, this guy is tripping. What do you make of that exchange?
Well, it's very intriguing, and you want to get caught up in the drama of it, but look at it from a legal perspective. This is a witness who, in effect,
Idea this was calling the shots, getting revenge for idea this was calling the shots, getting revenge for his nephew.
I think it works very well. I think that's why the prosecution put him on, even though they knew he was not going to be a witness that they wanted. You still have to take a witness as you find them, right? It was the timing was so tight as far as the revenge, if that's what it was. And look, we're going to hear from the prosecution in the closing argument. Look, we don't have witnesses here. We brought you the witnesses that we had. They come with their biases and predispositions, but you have to look through what their dispositions, but you have to look through what they didn't want to tell.
Even after he knew they exploited 14-year-old girls for sex. John Ossoff is going after the powerful and passed a law to stop child sex trafficking.
You want to talk about it? You're going to have a problem. Treat me as a hostile witness.
Joining me now are Martin, attorney and legal affairs commentator, and CNN's Josh Campbell. Josh, to you first. You were outside court as all of this was going down. Give us a sense of if he was the most memorable witness of day two.
Certainly the most memorable, the most colorful, the most peculiar witness I think that a lot of us have seen in the past, and just to kind of walk you through his actual testimony and how this would actually land with the jury. He didn't actually have firsthand knowledge of what occurred at the shooting itself. And that's something important to understand, because when the jurors actually get to their deliberations and they think back on all the witnesses and they think back on all their note taking, they're going to want to know, well, what happened at that point in time. So while he's obviously memorable and some of the things that he said in court were quite unusual, what he really did was provide a situation, a sense of the culture at the time between these competing factions. And in the aftermath, one thing I'll say that is notable is that the defense was questioning him, and many of his outbursts, if you want to call them that, or the hostility that he was expressing was towards Dwayne Davis's own attorney, which was quite unusual. He even told him that, look, I'm not trying to send this guy to jail. You are with your questioning. Again, very unusual. And the last thing I'll note is that the judge gave this witness a lot of latitude here. I mean, Ariva, you know this, and Sarah, you know this from covering so many trials. If you have a witness saying, look, I'm not going to answer your questions, you ask me something I don't want you to ask me, we're going to have a problem in here. We all know judges who would have shut that down immediately. But I think because he didn't have that firsthand knowledge, that's why he was given a little latitude. But it certainly helped the jurors understand the competition between these factions at the time.
Yeah, the infighting and the cross-gang fighting as well. You mentioned something, and I'll go ahead and play it, highlight this moment when you see this testimony where he addresses what he hopes happens to the defendant, even though he says he doesn't like it. Listen.
I got to raise the witness, but you asked me a question. I don't, and what I explained to them, I don't want to send him to prison.
Sure.
Even though we don't like each other.
Sure.
I'm curious, Ariva, as you're watching this, did this testimony help further the prosecution's case, or did it potentially hurt their case?
Well, I think, Sarah, the issue here is the prosecution uses witness to try to establish the retaliation that is a big part of their case. As you know, this case for the prosecution is basically their efforts to prove that there had been an altercation at the MGM Hotel after the Mike Tyson fight, and that this shooting of Tupac Shakur was retaliation for the fight that had happened earlier in the day. And this witness could attest to the fact that he was there was security, there was a fight that was happening, and that these two factions were warring at the time. Clearly, as Josh said, very difficult witness, made it very clear to the defense attorney that he believed that the defendant was talking too much, that this was against the code of ethics that these gang members or former gang members have. So I think he did the prosecution some good in terms of his testimony, but he also helped the defense because he said, look, I'm not going to give you any names. So he did not give the testimony that Dwayne Davis was at the scene when the shooting actually occurred, which is what the defense is arguing all along. This is one big fictional story, and that Dwayne Davis actually had nothing to do with this murder.
Right, and Dwayne Davis himself, the only person so far that we have heard say that he was a part of this was Dwayne Davis himself in past interviews with police and his book and some of the things that he said publicly on podcasts and in documentaries. Josh, I am curious about the scene there, what you're seeing around all of this. 30 years in the making, and so much culturally has been said about what happened here with all kinds of conspiracies and accusations about rival gangs and the East Coast, West Coast battle.
That's right. I mean, one thing that was interesting on opening day, it was a bit of a madhouse there, where you had a lot of people there outside the court, people that were fans of Tupac Shakur, and you had some people who were there just trying to understand, well, what is happening here? And the fact is, we set up outside the courthouse as the media, and anytime you see dozens of reporters, people will naturally ask, well, what's happening here? And it was really interesting for me to answer those questions and tell them, well, this is the Tupac murder trial. Some people were wide-eyed, like, what? Arrested someone for Tupac's murder, 30 years ago? And some people were following along very closely. Of course, the big question for the jury, they expect jurors to be unbiased, but what are their thoughts? What's their history? What are their views on these? That will be interesting. The last thing I'll note is that one thing that we saw in court yesterday, that was impactful were autopsy photos that were shown to the jurors. And I think that's important because up to now we talk kind of theoretically.
And then out we go. Live the dream. Make it go. We did.
Of Dwayne Keefe D. Davis, the man accused of orchestrating the 1996 killing of rapper Tupac Shakur. This week, combative and sometimes contrite testimony from a former Death Row Records associate who worked in the nightclub that Tupac was going to perform in that night. Witness James McDonald, known as Mob James, told the court to treat him as a, quote, hostile witness. At one point, he made his intentions for the defendant very clear.
What I explained to them, I don't want to send him to prison. Sure. Even though we don't like each other. Sure. I don't want to send you to prison. So that's why I'm here where I'm at and where I am. Because I've changed my life. I'm raising my grandkids, teaching them never to be like their papa. And here I am explaining to people what I used to be. And I'm not proud of that. I'm not proud of that at all. And you asking me questions that can hurt him.
Joining me now, CNN legal analyst and criminal defense attorney, Joey Jackson. This was, breathtaking, some of his testimony. I'm curious what it did to either help further the prosecution's case or do the opposite.
Yeah, so Sarah, good morning to you. I think what the prosecution's doing is laying the foundation, right? Now, they did a few things yesterday, and I think amongst those things were, you saw that, Mob James, and why is that relevant? If you're talking about and charging someone with gang-related activity, you have to educate the jury with respect to gang-related activity. There's this rivalry. There's this gang called the Bloods, the Crips. There's Death Row Records. There's Bad Boy Records. This is what the rivalry was about. This is what the street code is all about. I think it also explains, though, in a subtle way, why there's 30 years that have gone by since, of course, the killing and now. And that's the street and the codes of the street and the code of silence. You don't speak. And so when you bring in someone like this, Mob James, he gives you a sense of the culture, a sense of, we're not going to say a word, we're just going to let things play out, and a sense of why we're here. But with regard to actually identifying Keefe D, Mr. Davis, right, pointing a finger, showing about his involvement, that was absent. And so I think that that's critical. The prosecution has to get with that, put him there, and not only put him there, but indicate what specifically he was doing to aid, abet, encourage. That's what they need to do to get a conviction.
You can see we're not going to get that from this witness who was very clear that he didn't want to be there and he didn't want any part in trying to further the possibility of putting the defendant in jail. I do want to ask you about this former police officer and Death Row Records security chief who also testified, Reggie White Jr. What did he share? What did we learn from him?
So again, I think that a foundation was a security guard who heard the shots, etc., what was happening, but with respect to actually the identification, we did not learn much. Again, nice to know that you were there. Nice to know there was chaos. Nice to know there were shots ringing out, but could not identify and actually establish that it was, and if he could, wasn't saying so, that it was Keefe D. I think if you look at it, what prosecutors did yesterday, also, Sarah, with the MGM, we saw that video. We saw exactly the video of the beating. Why is that important? You didn't see in the video Keefe D. He wasn't there. However, they are prosecutors using that to show motive. This is what happened to his nephew. That's why he was so upset, and therefore, 3 hours later, of course, you have Tupac who was shot. 6 days later, he's dead, and so prosecutors wanted to do that. We also learned about the cause of death, right? That's not in dispute with respect to the chest, the abdomen, right? But prosecutors have to prove that. So to date, if you evaluate what's happening, a lot of foundational pieces, learned a whole bunch about the 90s, a whole bunch about gang activity. The prosecutors have to get to establishing that he did it, Keefe D, or certainly was involved in it to get their conviction. To date, have not done that, but awful lot of learning about what's happening.
Yeah, and a long way to go in this trial. We learned a lot about the why, certainly so far. Thank you so much, Joey Jackson.
Prosecutors in Las Vegas are trying to shed new lights on the fatal drive-by shooting of Tupac Shakur back in 1996. Dwayne Davis accused of orchestrating denies the allegations, and he's pleaded not guilty. CNN's Josh Campbell walks us through the latest round of evidence that's been heard by the jury.
Day 2 in the murder trial of Dwayne Davis. This is a man who is charged in connection with the murder of legendary rapper Tupac Shakur here in Las Vegas nearly 3 decades ago. Now, on the second day of the trial, the jury heard from a forensic pathologist, member of the medical examiner's team, who walked through the cause and the manner of Tupac's death, looking at a series of photographs, very graphic photographs that were shown to the jury. Here's what the medical examiner said.
Were you able to determine sort of the path of this particular bullet?
Yes.
And what was that?
It entered here in the right lateral aspect of the chest, just below the axilla of the armpit, and then went across the right chest space, went across the right lung. He died of gunshot wounds of chest and abdomen.
And do you have an opinion as to the manner of death?
Yes.
What is that?
Homicide.
Now, jurors also heard from a series of law enforcement officers who were on duty that night near the Las Vegas Strip whenever Tupac Shakur was shot. One of them had described an incident that occurred just hours before the actual shooting. This was at the MGM Grand here in Las Vegas. It was following a Mike Tyson fight. What prosecutors had alleged was that Orlando, who was the nephew of Dwayne Davis, the man on trial, that he was essentially beaten up by an entourage of Tupac Shakur. And you can actually see on surveillance footage that brawl taking place. Interestingly, one of the officers said that he interviewed Orlando after that incident.
And he told me basically that a couple of guys that he didn't know jumped him. And once again, I asked him if he needed medical. He said no. I asked if he wanted to file a report, and he said no.
Now, him saying he didn't want to press charges is very interesting because this is something we've heard about throughout this trial, and that is this so-called code of secrecy among various gang factions. If you go back to day 1 of trial, the jurors had also heard from a law enforcement officer who was actually there with Tupac on the way to the hospital, trying to get information from the victim here.
He was still talking, and I was trying to convince him to tell me the name of whoever his assailants were.
And did he ever respond?
Yes, he responded, no, we'll take care of it. So something like that.
And of course, what that meant for law enforcement officers is that they had to rely on other evidence, other witness statements. And of course, we're talking about 30 years ago. One thing that the jurors aren't seeing is advanced technology, such as security camera footages, which are now, in this era, ubiquitous around Las Vegas and many major metropolitan areas around the world. They didn't have that 3 decades ago. So there isn't actually video of the actual shooting itself, which again is why the jurors in this case are having to rely on the witnesses. Of course, one strategy of the defense here is to say that although Dwayne Davis made a series of statements in interviews, including to law enforcement, in the years following the shooting, talking about him being there that day, the attorney now says he made all of that up. Don't believe him. Again, a lot of this, without the typical type of evidence that we're used to in the modern day trial, this jury will have to rely on the word of mouth, people who were allegedly there, what they saw, what they heard. Back to you.
Happening today, more testimony expected in the murder trial of Dwayne Keefe D. Davis, the man accused of orchestrating the 1996 killing of rapper Tupac Shakur. This week, combative and sometimes contrite testimony from a former Death Row Records associate who worked in the nightclub that Tupac was going to perform in that night. Witness James McDonald, known as Mob James, told the court to treat him as a, quote, hostile witness. At one point, he made his intentions for the defendant very clear.
Well, I explained to them, I don't want to send him to prison. Sure. Even though we don't like each other. Sure. I don't want to send
Embrace Dave.
I'm raising my grandkids, teaching them never be like their papa. And here I am explaining to people what I used to be. And I'm not proud of that. I'm not proud of that at all. And you asking me questions that can hurt him.
Joining me now, CNN legal analyst and criminal defense attorney, Joey Jackson. This was, breathtaking, some of his testimony. I'm curious what it did to either help further the prosecution's case or do the opposite.
Yeah, so Sarah, good morning. I think what the prosecution is doing is laying the foundation, right? Now, they did a few things yesterday, and I think amongst those things were, you saw that, Mob James, and why is that relevant? If you're talking about and charging someone with gang-related activity, you have to educate the jury with respect to gang-related activity. There's this rivalry. There's this gang called the Bloods, the Crips. There's Death Row Records. There's Bad Boy Records. This is what the rivalry was about. This is what the street code is all about. I think it also explains, though, in a subtle way, why there's 30 years that have gone by since, of course, the killing and now. And that's the street and the codes of the street and the code of silence. You don't speak. And so when you bring in someone like this, Mob James, he gives you a sense of the culture, a sense of, we're not going to say a word, we're just going to let things play out, and a sense of why we're here. But with regard to actually identifying Keefy D, Mr. Davis, right, pointing a finger, showing about his involvement, that was absent. And so I think that that's critical. The prosecution has to get with that, put him there, and not only put him there, but indicate what specifically he was doing to aid, abet, encourage. That's what they need to do to get a conviction.
You could see we're not going to get that from this witness who was very clear that he didn't want to be there and he didn't want any part in trying to further the possibility of putting the defendant in jail. I do want to ask you about this former police officer and Death Row Records security chief who also testified, Reggie White Jr. What did he share? What did we learn from him?
So again, I think that he was a security guard who heard the shots, etc., what was happening. But with respect to actually the identification, we did not learn much. Again, nice to know that you were there. Nice to know there was chaos. Nice to know there were shots ringing out, but could not identify and actually establish that it was, and if he could, wasn't saying so, that it was Keefy D. I think if you look at it, what prosecutors did yesterday, also, Sarah, with the MGM, we saw that video. We saw exactly the video of the beating. Why is that important? You didn't see in the video Keefy D, he wasn't there. However, they are prosecutors using that to show motive. This is what happened to his nephew. That's why he was so upset, and therefore, 3 hours later, of course, you have Tupac who was shot. 6 days later, he's dead, and so prosecutors wanted to do that. We also learned about the cause of death, right? That's not in dispute with respect to the chest, the abdomen, right? But prosecutors have to prove that. So to date, if you evaluate what's happening, a lot of foundational pieces, learned a whole bunch about the 90s, a whole bunch about gang activity. The prosecutors have to get to establishing that he did it, Keefy D, or certainly was involved in it, to get their conviction. To date, have not done that, but awful lot of learning about what's happening.
Yeah, and a long way to go in this trial. We learned a lot about the why, certainly so far. Thank you so much, Joey Jackson. It's a pleasure.
Always.
I don't want to send him to prison. Sure. Even though we don't like it. Sure. I don't want to send you to prison.
That was one of Suge Knight's former security.
Make sure y'all like, share, and subscribe to the channel, man. Malone TV News.
The night he was shot in Las Vegas.
Boy, see him to
telling
go
the defendant,
five right
Keefy
here.
D, accused of being the shot caller, not the one who pulled the trigger of Tupac Shakur, I don't want to send you to prison. The prosecution had a clear goal today, to demonstrate a personal feud between defendant Keefy D and his Southside Crips versus Tupac and Suge Knight, who were associated with a rival gang called Mob Pyros. McDonald testified about street code, saying that he believed Tupac inherited the beef between Suge Knight's Death Row and Sean Diddy Combs' Bad Boy Records. But he made it very clear that he did not want to be there testifying today. He was subpoenaed. He was not voluntarily appearing. And at one point, when he was questioned by the defense, things got really tense.
Is that what you're telling me?
I'm telling you, the people that was at 662.
Just answer my question, sir. Yes or no.
I can't answer that without what you call it. You trying to tell me to say something that you're not going to understand. If you let me explain to you.
No, answer my question.
I'm not answering nothing. I don't know what you're talking about. You ask me something I don't want to talk about, you're going to have a problem. Treat me as a hostile witness. You're not going to talk to me and tell me as a grown man what I have to do up here. I'm not going to send him to prison. You are.
Remember, that was the prosecution's witness that was called today, and that was a cross-examination by the defense counsel. Today, the jury also saw some very graphic images of Tupac's body from his autopsy.
Hated
And these
to see this
pictures
shit.
of the body bag and the bullet fragment that was removed from his body. But remember, prosecutors are not alleging that Keefe D actually shot Tupac Shakur. They say that he was the person who sought vengeance against the two men for beating up Keefe D's nephew, Orlando Baby Lane Anderson, at the MGM after the Mike Tyson fight, all in retaliation for an earlier incident miles away where one rival gang member took the necklace off another.
Are trying to shed new lights on the fatal drive-by shooting of Tupac Shakur back in 1996. Dwayne Davis, accused of orchestrating that killing, denies the allegations, and he's pleaded not guilty. CNN's Josh Campbell walks us through the latest round of evidence that's been heard by the jury.
Day 2 in the murder trial of Dwayne Davis. This is a man who is charged in connection with the murder of legendary rapper Tupac Shakur here in Las Vegas nearly 3 decades ago. Now, on the second day of the trial, the jury heard from a forensic pathologist, member of the medical examiner's team, who walked through the cause and the manner of Tupac's death, looking at a series of photographs, very graphic photographs that were shown to the jury. Here's what the medical examiner said.
Were you able to determine sort of the path of this particular bullet?
Yes.
And what was that?
It entered here in the right lateral aspect of the chest, just below the axilla of the armpit, and then went across the right chest space, went across the right lung. He died of gunshot wounds of chest and abdomen.
And do you have an opinion as to the manner of death?
Yes.
What is that?
Homicide.
Now, jurors also heard from a series of law enforcement officers who were on duty that night near the Las Vegas Strip whenever Tupac Shakur was shot. One of them had described an incident that occurred just hours before the actual shooting. This was at the MGM Grand here in Las Vegas. It was following a Mike Tyson fight. What prosecutors had alleged was that Orlando, who is the nephew of Dwayne Davis, the man on trial, that he was essentially beaten up by an entourage of Tupac Shakur. And you can actually see on surveillance footage that brawl taking place. Interestingly, one of the officers said that he interviewed Orlando after that incident.
And he told me basically that a couple of guys that he didn't know jumped him. And once again, I asked him if he needed medical. He said no. I asked if he wanted to file a report, and he said no.
Now, him saying he didn't want to press charges is very interesting because this is something that we've heard about throughout this trial, and that is this so-called code of secrecy among various gang factions. If you go back to day 1 of trial, the jurors had also heard from a law enforcement officer who was actually there with Tupac on the way to the hospital, tried to get information from the victim here.
He was still talking, and I was trying to convince him to tell me the name of whoever his assailants were. And did he ever?
Mazda doesn't merely excel in driving dynamics and styling. Their vehicles are some of the safest on the road. The IIHS just recognized 8 Mazdas in both Top Safety Pick and Top Safety Pick Plus categories for how they during crash tests, crash avoidance systems, great in an exciting vehicle to drive, being safe doing both.
Having to rely on the witnesses. Of course, one strategy of the defense here is to say that although Dwayne Davis made a series of statements in interviews, including to law enforcement in the years following the shooting, talking about him being there that day, his attorney now says he made all of that up. Don't believe him. Again, a lot of this without the typical type of evidence that we're used to in the modern day trial. This jury won.
Right now, the murder trial of hip-hop legend Tupac Shakur is back in session. Prosecutors allege the defendant, Dwayne Davis, didn't pull the trigger in Shakur's death, but that he orchestrated the attack. Among the pieces of evidence, they're talking about references from Davis's memoir, an audio of Davis talking about his involvement in the murder. His defense maintains all of his past comments are, quote, full of crap. Joel Anderson is a senior staff writer at The Ringer and co-hosted the podcast Slow Burn, Biggie and Tupac. Thank you so much for being here. So you, when you were putting your podcast together, that was the time when Dwayne Davis's memoir was released. I know you reached out to him. Can you share what his response was and how, or if that informs how his defense is presenting or defending him right now?
Yeah, sure. So I reached out. It would have been December of 2019. This is the final days of producing this podcast, and my one of our production assistants had given me the number, and I give him a call, tell him who I was. I was surprised he picked up the phone, and he goes, "Hell no." Okay, and he said a few other words that I probably shouldn't repeat here on CNN. But my understanding and what he told me was that, look, I don't do these for free, right? And I couldn't promise him any money. That's just not the journalistic standard that we were working with at Slate. So I knew that I was going to probably not be able to talk with him. And it didn't help that I had also spoken with the detective that had kind of landed him in all this mess. So, you know, but it was good to hear his voice on the phone. Like, I was surprised that he picked up his phone, but yeah, there was, unless I had some cash, he wasn't gonna talk to me.
But what does that tell you? It's not that he didn't want to participate. He didn't want to participate unless you were willing to pay him. What does that tell you about where he is now and what his attorneys are arguing about all of the things that he said, including in his memoir, about his involvement in this murder?
I think that he's a desperate old man who was suffering from cancer. So I think that sort of characterizes some of his response there, that he needed money really badly. I mean, think about it. I mean, he'd been a fairly prolific drug dealer for a number of years, and then he had to go to prison a couple of times, and that kind of took him out of the game, and then he suffered with all these health injuries. He needed to make money some sort of way. And so he has this great story that he could capitalize on, and I think that he thought that he was protected by the law at this point. He's like, well, nobody's ever come after me after all this time. They're never going to charge me. Even people that initially worked on this investigation said there will never be any judicial closure in this case. So I think he had a sort of a false sense of confidence that I can use this story now to help fund my lifestyle. And so he just went ahead and talked with whoever was willing to pay him enough to do it.
As that you did in this fantastic podcast, are you surprised that he was charged?
Oh, absolutely. Well, I mean, obviously not now, but when it happened at the time, I was, because if that 25, 26 years since the murder, so you're thinking, okay, nobody's going to be doing justice on this, and even the people that worked the case thought that. But I think a couple things changed for Keefe D, and I call him Keefe D, not Davis. But one of the things that changed is that he moved. He moved from California to Nevada at that time. So that put him sort of in more legal peril, because that's where the case was active. They ended up getting new law enforcement, a new sheriff came in, and that put him in more legal peril, somebody who was motivated to solve the case. And then he just kept running his mouth about it. You know, like, yeah, I mean, I think maybe if he had done maybe a few fewer interviews, maybe it wouldn't have antagonized as many people as it did, but he's making a real big show of like, I was involved in this guy's murder and nobody's ever going to do anything about it. He even says that near the end of his memoir. So I think he took a little bit too many chances to down the stretch here.
Day 2 now of testimony. Shakur murder trial underway. Jurors hearing more audio from a 2008 police interview with Dwayne Davis. He, of course, is the man on trial for orchestrating Shakur's 1996 slaying. Prosecutors say Davis admitted to his role in the rapper's murder, but Davis has pleaded not guilty. Prosecutors say Davis was the mastermind in a revenge plot against Shakur after a mob beating of Davis's nephew. The first witness called today, a former crime analyst for the Las Vegas Police Department who was present at Shakur's autopsy, and jurors were then shown graphic photos of that. Joining me now is Matt Murphy, a former homicide prosecutor from Orange County, California. Matt, it's good to have you with us. So it's been so interesting what we're seeing, right, just on the first day and change of this trial. So much of what we heard from the defense team is that the book was a fabrication. The defense team also raising questions about the quality of law enforcement's original investigation, saying the prosecution has, in their words, really making it clear their client lies and cannot be believed. Do you think it's going to be difficult for this jury to distinguish between fact and fiction?
Well, that's always the challenge for a jury, right? And that's really a jury's role, is to figure out who's telling the truth and who's not. There's a great expression in Spanish that translates roughly to a fish always dies by its mouth. And I think this is a good example of that. The prosecution, look, the things that aren't aren't lies is Tupac Shakur really was murdered that night. Suge Knight was also shot. There's, the prosecution has plenty of evidence. The question, of course, is who did it. It's also important to remember that all they have to establish here is that Mr. Davis did anything to facilitate, encourage, or promote this, and according to his own story that he's told, not just in his book, but to a federal task force in 2008 and like uncountable media appearances, he handed that .40 caliber Glock handgun to the shooter to avenge basically the beatdown that we all saw on video. And that's another thing that was real, that casino beatdown. But one of the most interesting things that nobody's talking about is all of those other people in the video, as well as the other three men in Mr. Davis's car, the gang lifestyle of the mid-90s, and we all remember the movies and how popular it was. All of those guys are dead now. They're either dead or in prison, and almost all of them are dead. They were killed in unrelated murders. So that's something that really shows it's a road to nowhere, the gang lifestyle. You wind up in prison or
Also, I mean, from the prosecution standpoint, right, you have to talk to any of those people, which is something that, you want those people who were around then. They're not available, which as they're building this case, some of the people who have, though, been brought in, some of the original investigators, those are some of the witnesses who we saw yesterday, and they were talking about how difficult it was to get anybody to talk in those initial investigations. What is the strategy there for prosecutors in establishing that?
So that's typical of pretty much every gang case you do. I've prosecuted gang cases for years, and that's a feature of it. And one of the things that the prosecution has countered that is they've alleged the gang enhancement. They've alleged that he was a gang leader. Mr. Davis was a gang leader, and what that does is by adding those substantive counts, by putting those enhancements into the actual charging document, that allows expert testimony so they can have people come in and explain what the gang culture was like and how
All right, y'all, we're going to stop it right there, man. Malone TV News, we out. Catch us on the next one, man. That was day 4 of the Tupac murder trial. Keefe D is on trial for orchestrating the crime, so we're going to stop it right there. Y'all get in the comment, tell me what y'all think. We out. Bleak.